Thank you for joining us tonight on this Wednesday evening for our time together, a time of study. I especially want to thank Abby Book and all of her team, everyone who helped, all of our congregation that helped make Vacation Bible School this past Saturday be such a success. Thank you, Abby, and all of your efforts and planning to bring such a wonderful Vacation Bible School together. Joseph has a special request. In preparation for Father's Day, he has asked for pictures of you with your father. So if you can get a picture, scan, take a picture of it with your phone or digital picture, you can email it to him or text it to him, and his email address and his phone number is in our announcements that we emailed out today. If you need that, please call our office. We'll make sure that you have that information, or if you have any questions at all. Fred Snodgrass was successful in a number of places in his life. He was, first of all, a baseball player for Major League Baseball, but he was also a successful rancher. He was a successful banker. He was a model citizen. He was an advocate for the family, speaking out on the needs of a strong family in a city. He was the mayor for Oxnard, California. And yet when he passed away, in spite of all of his great successes in life, and there were many, the only thing that was listed in his obituary was his greatest failure. The New York Times, in his obituary, said at his passing in 1970, Fred Snodgrass, age 86, baseball player, has died. The one who dropped the fly ball in the 1912 World Series. Interesting, all of these amazing successes, but his biggest failure, that one dropped fly ball in the 1912 World Series, is the only thing that could be found to list for Fred Snodgrass. And it's true, he dropped a fly ball. It was a game, 1912 World Series, and he had actually caught the ball, took his eye off of it, and fell out of his glove to the ground. Had he caught that ball, the game would have been over, and the then called New York Giants would have won the World Series. His error that took place in that game, a lost catch, a dropped ball, a mistake, would be something that followed him the rest of his life. We've all dropped the ball in some area of life. A poor decision, a marriage, a family, a situation in our lives, a relationship that we just dropped the ball and failed to do what we should do. A big mistake. And for many of us, those memories linger in our lives of the time that we dropped the ball. And of course, Satan always likes to remind us of our many failures. We could just fill in the blank. And in our series, Journeys with Jacob, our study of the life of Jacob, we've come to an understanding that Jacob too has dropped the ball many times. He's made many, many mistakes, failures, and we come to a place now, a pivotal moment in his life where he must face his past, where God brings him to a time where he must deal with his past. I've called our lesson tonight, The Place of Emptying, looking at Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. I hope you'll tune in. I hope you'll open your scriptures. We have them on the screen as well that you can follow along with. This is indeed a crucial moment in Jacob's life. Of all the moments in his life, it comes to this point. Jacob has lived up to his name, supplanter, his name, hill grabber, but that's all about to change. And from the time that God brings him to this crisis moment, this pivot moment, this breaking point, this tipping point in his life, it's here that it changes his life forever. And God often allows us to go through crisis moments, challenging situations, not for the purpose of letting us feel defeated, but for the purpose of letting us come to a place of emptying, bringing us to a place of surrender, bringing us to a place where our hands are open and we let go of whatever it is we're gripping onto and surrendering it to God. This is such a place for Jacob. And I think that we'll all identify with what Jacob's gone through in this very moment in this text. After all these years, Jacob meets his match at midnight on the banks of the Jabbok River. I want us to notice, first of all, the setting. What's the time that this is taking place? This encounter with God that we're soon to read about takes place at the end of Jacob's 20 years in Padan Haram. Those were not easy years, but they were years in spite of the difficulty. God blessed him, increased his flocks, increased his family, prospered him, blessed him on the left and blessed him on the right. And yes, they weren't easy years. He had his wages changed multiple times. He had promises made to him by Laban and then were not kept. But now he's free of Laban at last. Laban is in the rearview mirror. And so this is the time that we find Jacob, who's come now to the Jabbok River. The place that this takes place at is exactly that. According to the text, it's the Jabbok River. Jacob was camping there next to the banks of this river, which flowed from the east to the west into the Jordan River. And it emptied into the Jordan River about halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. It means, the name Jabbok means the place of emptying. And even the name itself sounds brutal. Jabbok. It would be pronounced in Hebrew, Jabbok River, the place of emptying. And once it flows into the Jordan there, it literally drops in. And this river is filled with deep ravines, gorges, water drops, and the water just drops into the Jordan that's there. It is the place of emptying. It's a tributary that feeds into the Jordan. Jacob knows that once he crosses over this river, he is now into the land of Canaan, but he's also into Esau country. It's interesting sitting here on these banks, looking south. Jacob knows that as soon as he crosses over, this is when he faces his past. The crisis, that's the third thing I want us to notice here when we think about the setting. The crisis, the reality is that our deepest experiences with God are often preceded by very challenging difficulties of some kind, a crisis that God has allowed. And Jacob is no different. Jacob is about to face a serious crisis that gets his attention. The biggest thing on his mind right now can be summed up in one word, the name Esau. For 20 years, he's lived with the memory of cheating Esau, not once, but twice. For 20 years, he's wondered, does Esau still plan to kill him? For 20 years, he's wondered, will I ever go back home? Will I see my mother again? He's wondered, and now as he's on the north side of this river, this is the thing that he's thinking about. And we've all gone through crisis moments. Sadly, it's in our crisis moments that we tend to call out to God the most. When things are going great, when things are wonderful, those tend to be the times that we least feel like we need God. When it's actually the exact opposite of that. We need God most all the time, in good times and in bad times. There's unfinished business in Jacob's life. There's a past that needs to be resolved, that needs to be reconciled, that he needs to clear up. And we're all familiar with, just like Fred Snodgrass, the past of dropping the ball, we're familiar with mistakes. We too have oftentimes needed to go back and clear things up, reconcile, get right with things that we've done in the past. So that's the setting. Notice, second of all, the struggle. And I pick up here in verse 32 of chapter 32 of Genesis. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions, so Jacob was left alone. Here he is on the north side, the banks of the river, and he knows that Esau is approaching with some 400 men from the south. He can only assume what Esau has planned, and during the night, he's made the decision to move his entire company across the river, his wives, his maidservants, all of his sons, his possessions, his flocks across the river. The river was fordable at this point. In fact, it's called the ford of the Jabbok River, because if you go to visit this river, you'll notice that most of it is filled with ravines, gorges, steep cliffs, a difficult river to cross. And any river can be difficult to cross, no matter what it's like. Jacob did not want to be caught vulnerable on the north side with his family still there. And so with the challenge of bringing everything across the river, he decides to do it at the time that he feels the safest doing it. He can get everybody across safely. He won't expect to see Esau until the next morning, maybe even later than that. By doing this, he proves that he is not in retreat. He is prepared to face his past and what he's done. Crossing any river can be extremely difficult. And this picture I have here of the Jabbok River shows the ravines on both sides. He's already crossed the Euphrates River, which would be no small feat to accomplish that. The word fording is a technical term for wading across a river. And the difficulty of crossing any river depends upon 5 different things. First of all, enemy opposition. If you are an army and you're preparing to face an enemy, if you have the opposition, whoever crosses the river first has the high ground. And so most military operations try to cross the river first to be able to take their enemy by surprise. He knows that Esau was still far enough away that he could cross safely. In ancient days of war, opposing forces wanted to ford the river first, and armies would go across in regular battle formation. In other words, they didn't go single file. They tried to stay in formation and go across. Philip, once at war, had a cavalry that was coming against him, and he decided to ford the river first. He ordered all of the troops in military formation to cross the river, shield by shield, person by person, and they crossed the river. And whenever the opposing force came, they were so impressed with the discipline to cross that river that they quickly retreated. There's another thing to take into consideration, not just opposition, but temperature of the water plays a big impact. We know that it had just been Hag Hagetz, which is the festival name for shearing of sheep. Laban had just sheared the sheep, and that happened in the springtime, right after winter, when they wouldn't need to be covered in all of this anymore, and so the shearing had to be done. So the water must have been warmer, we would think, there in that region going into springtime, so the cold water would not be a problem. Another factor is the type of river bottom. Rocks at the bottom can add difficulty. Xenophon's army of 10,000 marching men were hindered by crossing the stones. They were slippery, they were sharp, and they were painful. And so stones and what type of river they're crossing can make it very difficult. The depth of the river is another factor. The maximum depth that a Roman army would ever try to go through is just chest deep. Anything beyond that was almost impossible to ford. The Romans followed that rule consistently. There's also another factor, and that is the rate of the current. If the current is too strong, it would be difficult to cross. Alexander, at one point, Alexander the Great had all of his force go upstream to block the current so that they could trickle by little in the slower current. Caesar would put his pack animals upstream to slow the current down. This is the situation here as Jacob's fording this river, and there's only a few places on the Jabbok that you could actually cross across. Most of the time, though, it would be filled with water. So this was a difficult crossing, especially given children, women, and all of the flock, and especially the fact that it was at nighttime. He did all that he could. After they had crossed safely, Jacob then returned to the northern bank of the river in order to be completely alone. He would not expect Esau until maybe tomorrow, sometime the next day. He knew his family was safe on the other side. His possessions and all that he had, though, were insignificant now because he's got to face Esau. Jacob, it tells us, is alone. And maybe I should say Jacob is alone at last. God has at last found Jacob exactly where he wants him. All alone. It's not Jacob. It's not just Jacob and God all of us have experienced this place of aloneness. It seems that one of the greatest problems that God has in teaching us is that we are always so busy, going. And sometimes God has to allow us to go through challenges in life to get us all alone. Get us to a place that he can actually teach us. And that's where he has Jacob at this very moment, this desperate moment where he can finally teach him. It's here where Jacob is slowing down long enough that he can talk to him, that he can teach him, that he can instruct him. And sometimes God does have to get our attention. A doctor's report, a pink slip, a financial problem, something that gets us to slow down. As Psalm 23 said, the Lord makes me to lie down. And sometimes he needs to make us to lie down. Because there's what we're wanting to do in our lives, but there's what God is wanting to do in our lives to prepare us for what he has planned for us, to change us, to transform us, to help us face our past, overcome our past, to lead us to the next step in our lives. That's exactly where Jacob finds himself at this moment. And what happens next has fixed itself into the imagination of Bible readers for over 3,000 years. What happens next has become a topic of much discussion, a topic of movies, a topic of phrases that even linger into our day, because it tells us in verse 24 that Jacob was left alone on the north side, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. The word Jabbok, the place of emptying, is an example of names that change over time. Sometimes events that transpire at certain places change a name. Jabbok originally meant the place of emptying, but today, if you were to ask someone in the Middle East, Jabbok means wrestler, to commemorate this event that's taking place of a man who jumps on Jacob. And there's many words in our culture that are like that. The word swipe used to mean to steal something, and now it means to swipe a phone. Tablet used to mean a stone tablet. Now it means a screen that you're looking at. And names are constantly changing because times change. So it's true with the word Jabbok. Today it means wrestler. Jacob is alone with his thoughts. He's watching the stars overhead when suddenly there is a man that jumps on him. Who is this man? Jacob is likely the one that writes this down, and he intends this to be taken literally. This is a literal event in history that has taken place, and Jacob wrote it down, and it eventually fell into the hands of Moses, who would have added it to the Torah scriptures. In Jacob's view, his combatant, his opposition was more than even an angel, maybe even the angel of the Lord. Later, Jacob would say that he wrestled with God. He saw God face, and he lived to tell about it. Some have wondered if this is not Jesus himself, pre-incarnate Jesus in the Old Testament, an appearance that he makes here in the scriptures. He and God went to the mat together in a wrestling match of the ages. He wrestled with God. The stranger grabbed Jacob around the neck, threw him to the ground. Jacob jumped up and jumped at him and lunged on him, driving his shoulder right into the gut of the attacker. You can see them fighting back and forth until the two fall flat on the ground. The stranger pushes off of him and pounced on Jacob, pressing his shoulders into the mud of the Jabbok River. Back and forth, blow for blow, body blow for body blow, throwing down, jumping up. The Jabbok's water, the sweat, grunting, howling, elbowing, scraping, clawing, straddling, wrestling, one on one. Each man wrestled the other, grabbing, struggling, rolling around in the dust, always aiming for some type of an advantage and looking to pin the other to the ground. Jab for jab. They said no words, only the deep grunting breath sounding like a horse, only the howling into the wind, panting. Hours passed. First, 1 hour. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Neither was able to gain advantage. Jacob is exhausted, but he continues to fight. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, then 3 o'clock. Hours passed over, and suddenly, as hours passed by, the darkness suddenly gave way to a distant gold hue on the horizon. Sunrise was not far away. And when the man saw that he could not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of socket. The word that's used here to touch is a light touch. This is no blow with the hand, no punch with the fist. It's just a touch of a finger, maybe even the little finger. Just a light touch. And it says that his hip bone was pulled out of socket and wrenched. And Jacob feels his thigh bone, his hip pull out of socket, enormous pain and sudden weakness, unable to walk. Crippling Jacob, rendering him unable to continue the fight, taking that which was Jacob's greatest strength at one point, the ability to stand upright, to walk upright, to do his job, tending sheep, and the lesson would be easy for him to learn. You see, this is a picture of Jacob's life. God is approaching Jacob, God himself wrestling with Jacob, showing him what much of Jacob has been like. Much of his life has been like. He's been wrestling most of his life, wrestling for a blessing, wrestling with his brother, wrestling with his father, wrestling with Laban. And God uses this picture in his life to show what Jacob has been like up to this point. What's going on here? Did Jacob actually prevail against God? The answer is yes, only because God allowed it. God's purpose here is not to destroy Jacob, to kill him. If God wanted to kill him, he could have done so in a split second. God's point here is not to make it easy on Jacob. God's point here is to show Jacob that he is wrestling with God. All of his life, he has been pushing back, challenging, twisting, manipulating, heel grabbing, using his own strength, finding a way to defy the odds. It's time to change. It's time to get past his failures of the past. Jacob was a fighter, a manipulator, a deceiver. He knew how to claw his way out of any situation. And God gives him a little bit of his own medicine, a wrestling match. Oh, it wasn't God's intention to kill Jacob, to show him, give him a mirror of what his life looks like at this point, and then with just the touch of a finger, get his attention and let Jacob know it's time to change. All of this has to come to a stop. God let Jacob do his best, and I'm sure he did. And God stood his ground, didn't give in either way. Blow for blow they went. But God left Jacob with a limp the rest of his life. God could have put his life to an end at any moment. The hip is the largest joint, weight-bearing joint of the body. It engages the strongest muscles from our thigh to our rear to our back, our hip. With one touch, just one tiny touch, he dislocated that whole area. The hip in this story is more than just the joint in the side. The Hebrew word can be used to refer to Jacob's vital organs, the organs that are here, that entail his backside, his back, his thigh, his groin. This left his body wrenched. What took place in this very event? The word is yarik, can refer to the thigh, the side, the loin. Yes, everything about this, the side of where God touched, was disfigured at this point. This location, this is the same location and the same word that's used by Abraham when he asked a servant to hold on to a certain place on his body, the yarak, and make a vow. It's the same word that's used to describe the descendants of Jacob, the yarak. It has to do with the place where his descendants would come from. The message that's here for Jacob is that you think you're strong, but in the end, you must depend on the strength of God. So my question to you, have you been in the river Jabbok? Have you been to a place where God has put you all alone and it's time to face the past? It's time to confess, to deal with. It's time to be honest with ourselves. And God lets us wrestle with him, just like he appeared to Saul and said, Saul, why are you pushing against the goads? God got his attention. Maybe you've been in that mud wrestling match, and you know full well, striving with God, coming to a place where you recognize that your strength is no match for God, coming to a place, the place of emptying. One thing we recognize here is that God doesn't play by our rules. At any wrestling match, that would be a penalty to touch someone in the hip, dislocate them. This isn't the world's wrestling match, playing by our rules. Though God sees things differently, his ways are higher than our ways. His ways are just. We often talk about, some might say, well, God, that's not fair to do that to Jacob. God's not about fairness. God is a just God. Some live 5 years, some live 105 years. Some are gifted with this talent, some are gifted with this talent. We are all different. And so asking God to come into this world and play by our rules is not going to happen. No, God plays by his rules. And when it's time to get our attention, he knows full well how to get us alone, how to wrestle us, and he especially knows where to touch us, to awaken us to who we are. This episode mirrors what the descendants of Israel would eventually do. They would be wrestling with God for years to come. It also serves as a model for believers to continue to hold on, because we continue to see in point number 3 the conversation that takes place. The sun is beginning to rise. This mysterious visitor is about to leave, and before he goes, he and Jacob have a brief conversation. The first words that have passed all night long. But we notice that now there is a new determination in Jacob. Look at verse 26. Then the men said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Jacob is exhausted. He has stopped wrestling, but he is holding on for dear life. At some point, he's come to recognize this isn't a stranger. This is God himself he is wrestling with. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." This, too, has been a picture of anyone going through a long, dark night, to cling on to God and to not let go. This is a new determination for Jacob. Up until this point in Jacob's life, he's used his own strength and ability. Now he has a new determination. I will not let you go. unless you bless me. Notice that there's also a new confession. In verse 27, the man asked him, "What is your name, Jacob?" "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. And mark it down. This was the turning point, the crucial moment. This is the breaking point of Jacob's life. Why did the man ask his name? God knew what Jacob's name was. What God's asking for is a confession. It's not, "What's your name?" It's, "Who are you, Jacob? Who are you?" He says, "I am Jacob. I am the hill grabber. I am the cheater. I am the deceiver. I am the supplanter. Yes, that's me. That was his past. That was him. He was Jacob. He was a Jacob through and through." And sometimes God asks us in these moments at the Jabbok River, it's time for a confession. What's your name, Scott? What have you been up to? What have you done? What needs to be confessed? What needs to be brought out? Notice that there's also a new name in verse 28. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob was the hill grabber. God says, that was you in the past. You've confessed who you are. I give you a new name. This is who you are and will be now. And there's actually an interesting wordplay, because the name Israel can mean two different things. Literally, it means one who fights with God, and it also means the opposite. God who fights for one. And we have both cases taking place here. Is Jacob fighting against God, one who fights against God, pushing back against him, and then the other, God who's fighting for Jacob? And the word means both. It's an example of a name that has come to mean different things through the years too, because of the event. Jacob who prevailed with God. Jacob who is prince with God is what some may render that name to mean. But in its original meaning, when God gave this name, literally God fights. Or the reverse, fighting against God. The beautiful picture that describes our condition. We who have constantly fight against God, we want it our way. We want to do it the way we want to do it. The things that we cling to, the things that we hold to, until we come to that place of confession where we confess who we are. And God gives us a new name that, yes, we fought against him. At the same time, we recognize that it was he, God, who was fighting for us all along. And that's what Jesus would say in the New Testament, that whoever would save his life must lose it first. Jacob has to come to this place of emptying of himself, this place where he is fully surrendered to God. Every time someone would call Jacob, now the name Israel, in the future, every time someone would call Israel, they were saying, God fights. God who fought for you. Israel, God who fought for you. Israel, it's time to come in for dinner. They're saying, God who fought for you. If Israel could have an email address, it would be godfights@israel.com. We need to be reminded that in any crisis we go through, it is God who is fighting for us, who's let us go through this situation. He's not trying to destroy us. He's not trying to kill us. He's trying to bring us to a place of surrender, a place where we empty ourselves, a place where we confess and see who we really are. So he had a new name. He also had a new blessing. Look at verse 29. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. He already knew who this was. Why is he asking his name? He knew exactly that this was God. The only problem is God didn't come like he thought he was going to come. Sometimes when we know people who wear a uniform every day, a police uniform, a fire uniform, and then we see them out in a grocery store out of uniform. We are surprised to see them because they look different. They didn't come as we expected. This is not how Jacob expected God to come. He's out of uniform. But yet this is God saying, you want to know my name? Surprise, it's God. Many times in a situation like this, a wrestling match, a difficult time in life, we tend to blame Satan. It's actually God who is at work in our lives, allowing us to experience something, to come to a breaking point where we can confess, where we can change, where he can transform us. And God in this gives him a new blessing. He who was at one point supplanter and deceiver is now one who fights for God and for whom God has fought for. He's saying, Jacob, my son, I know you better than you know me. And let's leave it at that. You don't have to manipulate people anymore. Now you and I are going to walk together. From this time forward, Israel was through and through God's man. We notice there's also a new walk. It says in verse 30, so Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites did not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Oh, when he got up after that wrestling match, the sun was rising. He began to cross the river. He had a new walk about himself. He limped because of his hip that was wrenched. He used to have a swagger in his step, maybe a strut, but now he walks with a hitch. And every step he takes, he remembers the day he met his God at the river, the day that God changed him. Jacob, like I said earlier, recorded this, but Moses must have added this additional information about how the Israelites in their time didn't eat this part of the body because it's in commemoration of this event where God had touched him. He was removing from Jacob any dependency upon Jacob, and now turning him to depend on God and God alone. When the sun goes down, he is Jacob, but when the sun comes up, he's Israel. At 8 p.m., he's the cheater, but at 6 a.m., he's the man who wrestled with God. Before the night, Jacob was in excellent physical condition, but by that morning, he walked with a limp. That event at Jabbok made all the difference in his life and changed him forever. We too have to learn how to empty ourselves, how to remove dependence upon our own strength, our own capabilities, our own talents, and turn to our God. We can willingly do that on our own through disciplines, through spiritual practice. Sometimes God has to allow us to go through these encounters so that he can change us. We learn from this lesson that Jabbok is a place of emptying. We empty ourselves. We remove human strength and depend on God's strength. We learn that Jabbok is a place of crossing, where we cross into a new life, perhaps like baptism, where we come out a new, transformed creation. Jabbok is a place of brokenness, where we're fighting all night long, but by the end, we are just clinging on to God, having lost all of our strength. We've given up the fight. We have nowhere else to go in desperation but to the living God, because we are broken. Oh, God could have gone hours more. He was journeying along with Jacob. We learn that this river Jabbok is a place of surrender. That which we cling to in our hands, we now surrender, not surrender conditionally, I'll do this, but rather an unconditional surrender, all to Jesus. I surrender. Jabbok is a place of transformation where we have now confessed who we are, and he has now transformed us with a new name. Jabbok is a place of God-given victory. Jabbok is very similar to what happens at baptism, a place where we meet Jesus and he transforms us and we come out a new creation washed in his blood. But yet we find all throughout our lives, God keeps bringing us back to the river Jabbok to continue to teach us the next step of life, the next thing he has us prepared for. Have you encountered the river Jabbok? If not, then get yourself prepared. If you are a Christian, one day, every believer, if not already, will one day visit this river in a spiritual sense to meet God, to be transformed forever by the experience that takes place there. Whatever crisis we go through, I want you to know we can trust God. He knows what is best for us. He knows exactly where to wrestle with us, and he knows right where to touch us, to get our attention, to turn our eyes upon him. Let's pray. Father, thank you for not leaving us to our own devices. You could easily step back and just let us go our own way. But Father, you take the time to train us, teach us, to get our attention, to get us all alone, not for the purpose of hurting us. Father, you want us to grow. Thank you for that. Thank you for wanting what's best for us spiritually, that we would be transformed and changed, regularly becoming more and more like your Son, Jesus. Thank you for the newness that you give to us, overcoming our past. Thank you for forgiving us for the times that we push back against you, that we fight against you. Thank you for being a God that blesses us in spite of it all and gives us a new future with a hope in Christ Jesus. Thank you especially for the forgiveness of sins. And Father, I thank you for this story that you've given to us. It helps us to understand a little more about the different challenges and difficulties that we go through. It's in his precious name that we pray. Amen.
Blessed be your name, a land that is plentiful, where streams of abundance flow. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name, when found in the desert place, or walk through the wilderness. Blessed be your name. Every blessing you pour out, I turn back to praise. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name. Blessed be your name. When the darkness closes in, Lord, still I will say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. 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 Blessed be your say.